Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, the League's Program Director. Welcome to this month's FF Distance Edition, featuring the work of Ken Smith Workshop. Ken and his studio team are Zooming from the New York City office, as is program moderator, Maria Bellalta. For the past 2 seasons, the FF series has been an online reinvention of the League's in-person First Friday studio tours and project reviews. Like First Fridays, these programs provide the opportunity to see recent and current projects, as well as to get a sense of where and how firms are working. This season, we've featured design practices that are redefining the public landscape by responding to social and environmental concerns and exploring the intersections of architecture, technology, and ecology. 4 of the offices have been New York City based, and we hope that local members and friends will take the opportunity to explore some of the sites they've designed in person over the coming months. This is the last FF of the current program season, and next year we're hoping to have a mix of both online and in-person visits, so watch for an announcement later this summer. That being said, it's really great to have the chance to share these online programs so widely. For instance, today, a quick skim of the sign-up list shows that there are audience members from over 20 academic institutions worldwide, including the University of New South Wales, the University of Pretoria, the University of British Columbia, and Cairo University. And here in the United States, the list goes from coast to coast, including Cal Poly, University of Texas, San Antonio, IIT, the University of Detroit Mercy, the University of Florida, UVA, RISD, GSD, Cornell, and of course, a number of New York City-based schools. Today's program moderator, Maria Bellalta, has an academic and professional career that also has a broad geographic reach. She's the Dean of the School of Landscape Architecture at Boston Architectural College, where she directs the Master and Bachelor of Landscape Architecture programs. She teaches design theory and practice, as well as advanced interdisciplinary and international studios with a focus on teaching and learning through cross-contextual and cultural experiences throughout the Americas. Maria is also a design principal with Bureau Verde Arquitectura in Mexico City. Her recent book, Social Urbanism, Reframing Spatial Design, Discourses from Latin America, examines the emergence of rapidly developing cities in Latin America and offers a vision for equitable urbanization through principles and practices of social urbanism. Maria, who is originally from Chile, received her MLA from the GSD and a BA in environmental psychology from Notre Dame. Following the presentation and Maria's conversation with Ken and his team, the discussion will be open to all attendees. You can pose your questions in the Q&A section, please, and use the Q&A section, not the chat section for questions. Before we begin, and as always, a thank you to the League sponsors. This program is supported in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as by the League's members, whose annual support makes all of our programs and events possible. Please visit archleague.org for further information about membership and the League's upcoming events, as well as past programs. Finally, towards the end of the program, information will be posted in the chat section for those seeking CEUs. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. It's a great pleasure to be here in New York and certainly taking part in the Architectural League of New York First Friday lecture series. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome. It's my honor and huge pleasure to introduce Ken Smith today, founding principal of Ken Smith Workshop, established in 1992 and situated in Chelsea. Smith's admirable work is focused on crossing the boundaries between art, architecture, and urbanism while addressing the cultural value of contemporary urban landscapes. I met Ken in the 90s during the avant-garde epoch of landscape architecture when his glowing topiary garden was all the rave. And today I continue to admire his disposition for transforming public spaces and public parks into landscapes that function as bold social platforms where we feel awake and alive as part of our urban experiences. Drawing from his training and talent in design and the fine arts, Ken's intentions are to go beyond normative and traditional landscapes as we know them. He is instead creating public spaces that embrace bold and diverse cultural traditions that are redefining 21st century landscapes. Through varied scales, contexts, and platforms, Smith's work is centered on the expressive power of landscape as an art form, as the conduit for new meaningful symbols in the landscape and therefore of space. Many of these are urban spaces, often worn, yet with an industrial force, repurposed and reimagined, imprinting today's busy landscapes with new sensational arenas for cultural engagement. Ken Smith is the recipient of numerous distinguished awards from the AIA New York and Florida, including recent Merit Awards of Excellence in Urban Design for St. Pete Pier in St. Petersburg, Florida, in addition to several ASLA New York and New Jersey awards, including an honor award for the East River Waterfront, Pier 35, and an honor award for the Croton Reservoir Water Filtration Plant in the Bronx. Smith has been recognized by ASLA National and with honor awards for the MoMA Roof Garden and for the Great Park Observation Balloon. He has been presented with a prestigious Masterworks Award by the Municipal Arts Society, and Ken received several awards from the National Park Service for his creativity and contributions to the heritage and preservation of the Santa Fe Railway Park, among many, many more. Ken Smith earned his BSLA degree from Iowa State University, where his affinity for the fine arts became clear. He earned his Master of Landscape Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design. He has been an educator throughout his career, teaching at the City College of New York and at Harvard's GSD. He has also lectured widely and has been published both nationally and internationally. Smith is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and a board member of the Architectural League of New York, advocating for the preservation of modern works of landscape architecture. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Ken Smith as he presents his lecture today, Recent and Current Projects. Thank you. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Nice to be here. As in person as we can be these days, it seems, for many circumstances. Let me take the screen here. I'd like to give you a little introduction to the firm, and then we'll present some projects, and then we'll end up with a discussion to finish things off today. My office is located in New York City, and as such, our work is mostly urban, and we've dealt with a lot of, I would say, recovery sites that had former uses or former occupation and needed to be transformed for more contemporary uses or purposes in our contemporary life. We're located in an old chocolate factory, the Runkle Brothers Chocolate Factory. And today we sit in the urban environment between the Hudson Yards and the Moynihan Train Hall. And our building is one of the very few remaining industrial smokestacks in New York City, which is quite a lovely thing to have. You can also see the High Line being built around our building. It's just a short tour of the office. These are my test plots. I grow oak trees from acorns. And we have a fairly spacious office, a lot of good light, a nice ceiling height. And it's a real workshop. There's a space to make stuff as well as to do computer work that we do mostly today. So I'm going to show a very short video and then we'll proceed to show some projects. Hi, I'm Ken Smith, a landscape architect by training, urbanist and artist by practice. And my practice is based in New York City and my work is mostly urban. In my practice, I pay attention to the history of urbanism and landscape architecture and the lessons of precedent. But more importantly, I explore the contemporary culture we live in today and the challenges, needs, and possibilities for moving the design practice forward. Over the course of my career, I have worked on a wide variety of projects, which has allowed me to address each site, program, and client as an individual inquiry, opportunity, and learning experience. The overall arc of my career, starting with early projects that were mostly small and art-oriented, has allowed me to focus on developing the medium of my craft, the way I make landscapes and how I think about them. As my practice has developed more recently, I've had opportunity to work on larger and more complex projects. I always try to work at multiple scales simultaneously. I have a saying I often remind myself to consider, which is, think big, think little, but skip the middle. So what do I mean by that? First, I think it is important to think big, design conceptually with the strongest ideas possible in determining the formal structure, organization, and systems of any landscape design. But equally important is rigorously thinking through the details, the granular qualities. Is it well executed? Is it palpable and tactile to people? And most importantly, are the details and the concept in alignment? And finally, my recent projects, especially the ones of larger scale, are more complex. They're often infrastructure in nature and have greater impact on public space than my earlier projects. I like to think of my current work as being art in the service of social purpose and environmental needs. From my perspective, landscapes have moved beyond the simple garden or anodyne green space. Today's designed landscapes are by necessity multi-purpose spaces and systems that are essential for creating and maintaining healthy urban environments and meaningful places for human life and culture. Thank you. So I'm going to show 3 projects today that are dealing with waterfronts that I've been working on over the past decade or so. Okay, here we go. So the first project is on the East River waterfront, and it's a project that is really about the persistence of an idea and carrying an idea forward from a project, even if the project doesn't succeed, which is the case here. I was working on ferry sites on the East River, working with Kennedy and Violich, architects from Boston. And most of the waterfront in Manhattan is defined by a seawall, which you see here. And this was the site of one of our project sites. And the ecology of the river has been reduced to a 6-foot scum line for most of the island of Manhattan, which is really quite sad and unfortunate. But in this image, looking at in the background, there was an old abandoned pile that had soil and a plant community that had blown in and established itself. And I thought that was actually quite interesting and quite beautiful. And that became the inspiration for this project. And the idea was to create an environment for a natural marshland. And part of the problem was that the walling of the city, the seawall, causes the flows to increase on the river. And it's very hard to establish plants because the power of the water moving quickly will rip the plants out. So the proposition was to create a series of planter boxes which would protect the plants from scouring, but also allow them to thrive and create a much richer liminal edge. And so this is an early study. And then this is the final design that was taken all the way through construction documents. But unfortunately, we were never able to get the environmental approvals in place for the project. So this project never happened. But a couple years later, I was working on the East River waterfront esplanade with shop architects. And we were working on Pier 35, and where it says Eco Park, that was a part of the pier that had collapsed. And rather than simply rebuilding the pier as it had been previously, the city wanted to do a prototype ecological installation that dealt with the tidal flows of the East River. And these were some early study models we did for creating a sloped and tilted terrain that would actually register incoming and outgoing tides and provide habitat for mussels. So this is the larger project, mostly finished in the picture on the left, adjacent to the FDR highway. And on the right, you can see the habitat we created, which we call Mussel Beach. And it's both an ecological resource, but it's also a social resource because it serves as the entryway from the esplanade into the pier itself. So there's a real human and ecological interaction that happens when people come into the park. Here you can see the view of this is pretty much at low tide, and you get a sense of the other social spaces that are embedded in the park for nearby residents. And it's really one of the few places in New York City where you can actually see and register tide coming in and coming out. If you spend even as little as 20 or 30 minutes, you can actually see the tide change, which is actually quite remarkable. Since we live in a city surrounded by water, most of us are actually completely cut off from it. This is a view of the green topiary wall that is part of the project that screens the adjacent sanitation plant. Some of the social infrastructure of social seating in the plantings, and the porch swings. At the far end of the pier, there's an elevated deck, a front porch, if you will, for the neighborhood, where you can come out and watch the life of the river with ferries and boat and life moving by. But the second project I'll show you is a project in Brooklyn on the Gowanus Canal. It's a historic site, an industrial site, highly polluted site that's gone through remediation, and it's being redeveloped for a very interesting program. This was the power plant for the Brooklyn Rapid Transit. It was built in the early 20th century, and the site was on the canal, and barges came in with barge loads of coal, which was piled up on the land, and a source of much of the pollution that has been remediated over the last several years. And this project is being converted into a cultural resource, which I'll describe. Hi, I'm at the powerhouse. It's on the Gowanus Canal, which is behind me. And it's part of a district that's changing rapidly from old manufacturing and industrial uses to higher density uses of commercial, mixed use, residential, and cultural facilities. So the building itself, half of it was torn down in the 60s or 70s. The other half that remained is really quite derelict when we started the project in 2017. This is a project where I'm working with Herzog and Demeron as the project architects. And the project is to convert this into an artist manufacturing space, to create studios for artists to learn manufacturing arts. And so it's very much speaking to the maker history of Brooklyn, where the city actually made things, had real industrial production and manufacturing production. And so this facility will be a cultural facility dedicated to that kind of production within our city.
So Herzog and Demeron began this project after an early selection process, and we were instantly inspired, not just by the existing conditions of the building, but also the fact that it was such a unique industrial site, and it was an intact original site. And landscape was so critical to this project because there was such a large, generous site involved. It was also about maintaining open space, and the fact that we could work so closely with Ken from the very beginning and let the architecture and the landscape disciplines talk to each other.
So the canal side is really a public a space designed for the public to use, and this was a real wreck of a site. It was like for decades and decades they had just pushed soil and crud and rocks and stuff to the water's edge, and there was a super steep slope all the way to the seawall, and there you couldn't even walk on it, and there was just a tangle of trees and plants. But we thought it was fabulous. We loved the character of that, and so we decided that we had to bring that character back. We also went to see some of the industrial sites along the canal where they were driving new sheet piles, and we loved the sheet pile as an aesthetic. And we went to the concrete yards and saw these big concrete blocks, and we loved those as an aesthetic. So we brought in those traditional materials to create this space. So this is what the site looked like when we first went there. This is that slope that had been kind of pushed toward the canal. completely inaccessible, but actually quite beautiful in many ways. The kind of raw nature and the ruggedness of it was very appealing. And while the site had to be completely stripped down to remediate the soil, the intention was to put a slope back. And in fact, the site has been built up, raised about 10 feet in elevation in response to the rising sea levels that we're planning for in New York City. These are some early studies looking at how to organize the space of the 40-foot width of this waterfront edge and provide public access, and to provide a toehold for a new kind of nature. And this was the image that was created to kind of give a sense of the character that we were aspiring to create along this waterfront edge. And simultaneously, as mentioned in the video, the team went out to look at some recent infrastructure work that was happening along the canal and the waterfront. And I think these sheet pile walls really appealed to us because they have kind of real girth to them. They're honest, they're direct, they're functional, and they're actually really beautiful, even if they're underappreciated. We also saw these at the concrete yards, these big concrete blocks that are used for retaining, and they also have a kind of honesty that was very appealing. And there were these piles of boulders that were used for reinforcing slopes that had a beauty to them. And the crushed gravel also was really integral to the place. So these four materials became our palette for creating the landscape. And there's an early study model showing the slope with planting and a grid of boulders to help reinforce it. And during construction, I would say I was during the main part of construction, which is the last half of this past year, I was on site once or twice or 3 times a week to make sure that things were installed correctly. And I would say that even though these are humble, tough materials, there was a rigor to their placement and organization that was very purposeful, very thoughtful. And it's really, I'd say, the interaction between the rugged material and the precision of their installation that kind of really gives it some power. And then these are some projects, some of the views when it's nearly construction finished. This is last January, I think. And this is the stepped wall, the seating wall made out of the concrete blocks. And this is really designed to blunt the force of a flood surge, because we know that during big storm events, we're going to have flood surges, and this protects the toe of the slope from erosion. And then the slope continues to raise the site up to a much higher datum, and then the boulders help reinforce that slope as well. And one of the things that we did here is that I designed this so that everything sits perpendicular to the slope. We created the slope, and then the boulders just sit on the slope. And the plantings are all planted perpendicular to the slope. And I did that intentionally because I want these plants to achieve a kind of rugged form. And so planting them, if you will, at an angle means that they're never going to develop into perfectly symmetrical, generically normal plants. They're always going to have a kind of distinct a character that's wild. And I think that's going to be really quite beautiful as it grows in. Also, it contributes to a feeling that somehow this whole landscape could be in some way sliding toward the canal. This is another view of that slope and the sense that it's sliding toward the canal. And you can see here that the sheet pile has been installed. Another view, that the meadow grasses are now starting to grow in between the boulders, and it's starting to green up substantially. And you can see the relationship of the slope to the stepped wall, to the gravel esplanade that people can occupy, and the seawall parapet. And what we did intentionally was we didn't want to have an ornamental railing. We actually saved money by just leaving the sheet piles 42 inches above finished grade, so that for no cost, we got a free parapet wall that is really very distinctive and very much part of the heritage of this area. And it's really got a beautiful set of bays that are very occupiable and quite comfortable and lovely. And I would point out in the background is Susanna Drake's Sponge Park, which is one of the very first environmental projects on the Gowanus Canal, and really a terrific project. So the third project I'll show is in St. Pete, Florida. It's a project that I worked very closely with Rob Rogers on, who I've worked with on a number of projects, starting out with 55 Water Street, the elevated acre, back in 2003. And Rob and I worked very well together. We worked very closely. We were good collaborators. And this was a competition that our team won. And there was an old pier there, which you see on the left, which was basically a 2-lane street that was almost a half-mile long out to a platform with an iconic restaurant and building on it. And when you went there and tried to walk out to there, it was just brutal, especially in a Florida summer. It was just a really unforgiving environment. It really had been designed for people to drive out, park the car, go to the restaurant, and drive back to the city. Our idea was that it should not be for automobiles. It should be for people and bicycles. And so we designed a pier that took the experience and stretched it all the way from the city, all the way out to the end, and made a series of iconic spaces all along the length to program it for activity. And so these are some early diagrams showing program and activity loops and looking at how it would connect to the city parks and to the city itself. And the landscape was really organized along two central ideas. In pink, you see what we call the cultural grove, and it's really taking sort of cultural landscape from the city and pulling it out toward the water. And this stretch includes the farmers market and cultural facilities like that, children's playgrounds and things that were designed by Barbara Wilkes. And then the green part that meanders through is the coastal thicket, which is an abstraction of the mangroves that you find in Florida. And this is the final design plan. The area on the right of the dash line is the part of the project that our team was responsible for. And on the left was the part that Architecture Barbara Wilkes was responsible for. And then the modeling that was done during design. One of the things that we did is we preserved some of the old piers that occur on 20-foot on center spacing. And we used that spacing to provide an ordering device along the pier as we developed it. The coastal thicket is over on structure, floating over the water. It's got substantial width and depth, so it has a real cubic footage of soil that it can support a robust plant life. And this is the completed project with the plaza and fountain in the foreground, the coastal thicket, the environmental center in the center, and then the pavilion on the end for special events. Another view showing the relationship between the new pier and the historic Spa Beach that is a natural beach. You can see the coastal thicket in the foreground. This is the plaza with the water feature that is both civic fountain and child's water spray. And there's also a tilted lawn in back. Florida, as you know, is really flat. So this is St. Pete's new hill, which people really love. And there's the coastal thicket, seeing how it hangs out over the water. And the boardwalks, which give a different kind of experience and provide some shade for that walk out to or from the end of the pier. And you can see some of the old piers floating in the middle ground there. And the view of how it ties into the city. So with that, I'd like to invite Hardy Stecker, Senior Associate in my office, to take over and describe a little bit of our design process.
Hi, my name is Hardy, as Ken introduced, and I just want to talk a little bit about the design process that we have through model making here at Ken Smith Workshop. This was an early project when I began in Lower Manhattan at West Street. And while this presentation model was something we used to relay the public landscape to the client and its relationship to the building, the design process with model making, you can go to the next one, Ken, really also spoke to this idea of not only physical models that were representational of the landscape. I'll just wait till the next one advances. But we actually also made models that sort of used ourselves in space as a way of like making this whole public landscape understandable. You know, we were mapping out the relationship to the building, the relationship to the pedestrian walkway, the relationship to a planting area, the relationship to a bikeway, a wall, and a lay-by lane. So that diagram up above shows this sort of bundle that we were trying to map out. And we did that at full scale so that we could all feel the public spaces that we were creating. And in the next drawing, you'll see, or series of photos rather, this was a model that we were using to convey the materiality of the plants and the sculptural quality of these boxwood forms that we were creating, as well as understory gardens of perennials, ephemerals, and matrix plantings that we developed with Pier. And his artistic way of bringing a plant palette to this landscape, this model, which we used also as a presentation tool, not only to the client, but to Public Design Commission, really spoke to areas of public space and planting and bikeway and road. And it also became a really key design tool for us in terms of mapping out these boxwood that were sculptural and had differing heights in 2 different species of boxwood. And ultimately they became the roadmap to create the construction document. So, you know, very much so the design process in the office, model making is dealing with 3 dimensions all the time, whether in a physical model or in Rhino, which we use now. And here, the built project, you know, really reflects the work that we did in model to figure it out spatially.
Thank you. And now Fei Xiang Yu is going to talk a little bit about one of our international projects that we're working on in Bangalore, India.
Hi, my name is Fei Xiang Yu. I'm a project manager at Ken Smith Workshop. So this is one of our international projects. This one is in Bangalore, India. As you can see, this is the site is a long rectangular site. It stretches 350 meters in one direction. So in this project, we have dealt with the stormwater management. So in the monsoon season in Bangalore, which is from June to October usually. During the monsoon season, they will receive a lot of rainfall. So at the lower 2 pictures, that shows the local prices, which is they use the under below grade channels to conduct the stormwater. So the next, this is our design, showing that we created a system that will conduct and then collect the stormwater to a reception tank. So on the section you can see that's the end of there are a series of rainwater recharge pit that was collected throughout the site through some of the linear drain that we set up.
Thank you.
So in the lower section, you can see the water, the watershed, the water falls based on the topography, going through sub drainage and then the surface drain, and then collect at the surface drainage or trench drain, and then flow back to the water harvest tank.
Thank you. And now Stephen Godanis will talk about something he worked on his first week in the office.
Thank you, Ken. Greetings, everybody. My name is Stephen Godanis. I'm a project designer here at Ken Smith. I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Steven Zimmerer. I'm an intern this summer. I'm pursuing my MArch, but I have a background in landscape architecture, and I was attracted to working at the workshop because of kind of a shared sensibility between my approach and the interdisciplinary work of the office.
Amazing. So when I first joined the workshop in January, I came at a time when the workshop was having a conversation with the Meatpacking District. And apparently people have been sitting on the planters that have been installed. So this gave us an opportunity to design seating. So on this screen, you can kind of see like a good spread of our process, which starts with some initial sketches that get turned into drawings and various study drawings, and eventually turned into renderings in Rhino. But there comes a point in our process where, of course, we're going to need to make a physical model. This was a collaborative group effort that we all chipped in, and you could see like we were working in the model space and we just got the materials on hand, and then we ended up taking it to the site. And I have to say that this is an incredibly satisfying image. It fits perfectly in, and it was really satisfying and really helped us understand the project.
And the client loved it.
They loved it.
It's always great. And these will start being installed in their permanent fabricated form in about another week. So finally, I just want to give an update on the Meatpacking District before we move into our discussion. I've been working on the Meatpacking District for over 10 years now, starting with the reconstruction that occurred along with replacement of subgrade utilities, and working with Marvel Design and URS ACOM. And basically the interesting thing on this was that the DOT, Department of Transportation, had determined that the street was overly wide. And so the street was rebalanced, 2 lanes of traffic were removed, and we were able to create new, quite generous pedestrian plaza spaces as part of New York City's pedestrian plaza program. But the part I'd like to describe now is the Open Streets program. Back in late March of 2020, during the lockdown, Jeffrey Lafrancois, the director of the bid, called me up and he said, we need to start working on the open streets so that the restaurants can start to move restaurant dining space outdoors so they can stay in business and survive financially. And so I went up to the site like early April. Jeffrey and I stood on like opposite sides of the street and spoke to each other about what we wanted to do. And I created an idea about something that related to the context of the Manhattan grid, the orthogonal grid, where it meets the village looser grid at Gansevoort Street, and this intersection of the 60-degree angle. And so the proposal was to create a series of planters that were hexagonal. And the notion was that they would be performative, that they could be opened and closed to either have a street that was closed off to traffic or opened when we needed service vehicles, fire vehicles, public safety. And this was the mock-up during production. We went to the fabricator site to test it out, and we were all very excited at this point because it really worked beautifully. And then this is some of the installation after they went in. The Corten steel turned orange actually much quicker than I expected.
Hi everyone, I am in the Meatpacking District and I want to show you something real cool. I'm here with Jeffrey Lafrancois, the president of the Meatpacking Bid, and Evan and Kevin. And we've got something to show you. This is a giant planter that serves as a barrier for an open street. This is Little West 12th. That is also an open street, also known as a shared street, where it lets cars through sometimes and other times not, pedestrianizes the street. So what do you have instead of a Jersey barrier or one of those like metal bike rack things? They use this planter, but it's a 3,000 pound planter. How do you move it? So they're gonna show us.
All right, 1, 2, 3.
So it's got this hinge here.
There we go.
It turns on this hinge. This side here has wheels. The other side is fixed. Opens and shuts. And you can see how when the two of them are closed, it creates a beautiful, yeah, let's see that one too. Just a beautiful barrier. What a way to pedestrianize a street. Really innovative things happening down here in the Meatpacking District.
So there's really nothing better than endorsement from the city council person like that. So at this point, we're going to break into the discussion. So we're going to move the table around for a moment. So bear with us. Yes, scoot in so you're all visible. Okay, great, terrific.
Right. Thank you, Ken and Hardy. That was awesome. And we already have a bunch of questions rolling in. But
good.
Before I invite the audience, I'd like to ask a couple myself.
Okay.
So it's clear to me that in your projects, the typical or expected conditions are often tweaked, exploded, if you will, to create new forms and expressions that are very dynamic. Can you talk about a little bit about what your perception or your intention is for the user's experience?
Well, I would start out by saying that I think our basic approach here is that one size does not fit all. We always take each project and think about it individually in terms of who it's for. And one of the things about doing public work is that there's always a question about who is your real client, because you're oftentimes working for a public agency, but your real client is actually the public, the people who are going to experience and use the spaces. And so some of it comes with experience. You know, I've been working in New York City for a long time now, and I know a lot of the neighborhoods, and some of it I've just internalized in terms of knowing what people want. But there's always a public participation or involvement aspect to almost all these projects, where we hear from people about what they want or need, or the agencies have done surveys about what people want and need. But I think the discussion we had earlier today, I was saying that I thought one of the things that made a public space successful is that on one hand, it has to have a certain tactility or a certain kind of groundedness that everybody can understand. But at the same time, it needs to have some abstraction or enough abstraction to it, because we live in really diverse communities in most urban areas, and we need to have spaces where everyone can come and sort of project their own thoughts and needs and desires onto the public space. So it has to be both very, grounded, and it has to be abstract at the same time, I think, to really be successful.
To allow individuals to sense it.
Yeah.
And thank you. Thank you very much. And I have a trick question.
I'll give that to Hardy.
Which is, if you had to pick one of your most transformational projects, which I think will be tough because there are so many and very memorable ones, which might it be and why?
Yeah, this is the favorite child question, which is always a problem. But I think the key word is transformational. And I think one of the things that we always try to find in taking work on in this office is projects that have the capacity to be really transformational in the communities that they're part of, to make a real change. And so I think in with that frame, I would say the rail yard park in Santa Fe is probably one of the most significant transformational projects that we've worked on. And I would say in part, it's not just the designers. I mean, we had a great team. I was collaborating with Fred Schwartz and Mary Miss, and we had a great design team on the project. But the city had been planning for this project for like a decade before the competition, the design competition. And the whole project had resulted from community effort to stop developers from doing generic development on the site. And the Trust for Public Land stepped in and saved the site and transferred to the city and raised the money for the competition. The AIA had done a RUDAP, which was a community participation process. The city had funded a master plan. So by the time we arrived on the scene, there was already a huge amount of work and effort that had already been put into it. And so when you have that kind of community basis and support already in place, that's very good because you have a project that's sort of wired to succeed. I think we brought a lot of fresh ideas to how the park could work, which contributed all that, but it wasn't just us. It was really us and the community that made it work.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that I get very critical when I walk into a space and I think, oh, I've had this feeling before, like the same old. So that sensational aspect is.
Right. And I have to say, as a side, I learned a little bit on that project, but we had one of our consultants, Joel Glanzberg, was he was a permaculture consultant, and I didn't really know much about permaculture at that time, 20 years ago. And at one point he said, the problem with you people out east is you grade like this, and he took a water bottle and poured it over his hand and just all drained off. And he says, out here we grade like this, and he poured the water in his hand and held the water in his hand. And that was like transformational for me because completely made me rethink how to grade the site. And so the whole site we did quite a bit of regrading the site to create major and minor retentions and retainment throughout the whole site to hold what little of that, 13 inches of rain a year that they get.
Yeah. Which actually brings me to another question, and then I promise I'll open it up, everyone. And speaking of grading, St. Pete's Pier in St. Petersburg, Florida, is an intriguing project and a beautiful project. And to begin with, it had this, as all piers do, very linear, almost one-dimensional aspect to it. And speaking of grading and the fact that this pier that you created has these angles and this edginess that really protrudes out to the water and also has some other levels going on. Please share a little bit, and Bernie, please chime in. Ken?
Yeah, well, you could tell us, we always grade, right?
Oh yeah, we were always grading, and contours are never like, wildly apart. We're down to,
3 inch.
3 inch, that was the project, we looked at earlier. Grading was completely driving that, and it always does. It's sort of, even in a project we're working on now, is like the first step in understanding how some other elements are going to cohesively work with grading. It's like fundamental to Ken and to the office's process.
And at St. Pete, the landscape is flat.
Right.
And actually you might think, well, great, that's easy. You don't really have to think about grading, but in fact, you actually have to think about grading a lot when it's really flat. And one of the things that was important for the pier is that the new pier was lifted up 4 or 5 feet to deal with sea rise. And so this plaza that we created was 200 plus feet long, and we were able to simply tilt it up at a 2% slope so that we created a horizon line. But when you enter the plaza, the horizon line now is not down at your feet. The horizon line is actually at your eye level. And so it actually edits out a lot that you don't see. And then that was reinforced with the tilted lawn, which further edited out the view of the features beyond. So it holds the plaza space as a space, but it also conceals a lot of that's beyond. And then when you move through the space past the tilted lawn, suddenly the whole waterfront opens up and reveals itself. And so it's a classic Andre Lenote conceal. Yes, and it really works.
Yeah.
And you know, you got to grade anyway, so it's really almost a free trick because it doesn't cost. Grading is usually cheap.
Yeah, it's funny that you have to add rather than maneuver what was there in this case. I mean, and really create it. And it is evident in that project. I have to go, but I love that project. All right, let me open it up to the audience. Thank you, everyone, for holding steady. And here's a very critical question, which is, what do you anticipate will be the most critical challenge facing landscape architects in the next 10 years? How do you see progressive and innovative practices like yours addressing these challenges?
Well, that's the right question. I would say that I don't think you can separate the environmental and the social challenge because they're totally linked together. The environmental challenges that we're facing with climate change and rising sea levels are going to create great displacement of people and migration and probably increase poverty and things. So I don't think you can look at it as merely an environmental or an ecological problem. It's both environmental and social. And I think all of our projects need to think of those two things really together and how we solve them in a kind of a connected way.
Do you think we're doing that well right now?
I'm not sure we're doing anything well right now, but but no, I think there's good intentions. I mean, you look at contemporary politics, and you got to wonder if anything will ever change. But when I was working on St. Pete Pier, you know, the state officials, the governor and the senators were all deniers, but the local officials, the people who were paying for the project and building the project, and it was their community, they all took sea rise seriously, and they spent the money to raise the pier up and think about it. And they also had a very progressive social program dealing with the underrepresented, economically underrepresented people in their city to have spaces in the market on the pier to actually help spread the wealth around from the local economy. So that project really was engineered for both ecology and social betterment.
Yeah, if I could interject, I think there's a real need to sort of hand off some of what we do well and invite the public to have their own contribution to that project or that mini part of that project, because otherwise there will be a lot of omissions. But anyway, thank you. Okay, let's move on. Here's a kind of fun question. Your landscapes are so artfully constructed. Are there artists out there or sculptors that inspire your studio?
Well, you want to start that one?
Well, I was just thinking about,
think for a
I mean,
moment.
this might not answer that question in that way, but I mean, one project that really integrated art by artists was Cole's Commons. There's a class in Des Moines, Iowa, which is a fantastic public civic open space in downtown Des Moines. And we had to react to an existing Klaus Oldenburg sculpture that's just fabulous. It's an umbrella, which links itself to, you know, it's travelers, right? Yeah. But anyway, the Oldenburg's there. And so as we were designing around that and respecting that in its place, and also creating, you know, usable space for programming small events, large events, ultimately a fountain, another artist was brought in, Jim Campbell. And so there was a dialogue between the Klaus Oldenburg, Ken's work, you know, and then we just recently kind of revisited this story, and I was reminded how much a part of, so we're actually looking at the archive and we're looking at the drawings and the hand drawings and the planting plans, but it talked also about Jim Campbell's piece and how that fit in, you know, geometrically, but it was in dialogue with Klaus Oldenburg and it was in dialogue with the plan for the park. So, you know, I think art pops up in different ways on different projects, just like, you know, you could speak to in that way, but, you know, That's a great example. I can see us.
The other
using
artists on that project were Jim Garland,
Jim
the
Garland,
fountain
yes.
designer, who's an artist.
it. Right, right.
And,
that
and Jim
actually is
Conti was the
lighting designer.
lighting. I mean, we
Yeah,
had really
yeah,
a great team.
Yeah.
But I would say that in my interest, it's always hovered between minimalism and pop.
Yeah.
And I think you can kind of see that both of those strains in the work. There is a kind of rigor to the minimalism that kind of holds the project together, but there are pop elements like the hexagons or things. So.
Well, I'll tell you, when you hung the beautiful flower necklace over the Fine Arts Museum in Boston,
Right.
I mean, and I was very near it at the BAC. I mean, that was just phenomenal. This beautiful pink necklace hanging there for weeks and weeks. It was gorgeous.
It was pretty wild.
Yeah. So let's stay with the artsy questions for a little bit. And there's a lot of attraction to your hex paver planters here. Who fabricated them? And there was something else. Certainly hope you have the trademark on those movable planters.
Oh, shit.
Yeah,
actually, I think the Meatpacking District bid probably has that, which is good.
And
But I would say I grew up on a farm, and those things are basically farm implement. The hinge and everything is
really?
we made a custom hinge with two pipes that fit together in a pin, and it's basically the way that a tractor and a wagon connect together.
that's
And
right.
so we dealt with it at kind of a farm implement level.
Or maybe the big corral fences.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on that vein, the farm, how did growing up in Iowa and going to school in Iowa impact your relationship to the landscape and to landscape architecture?
Well, a farm is a big landscape. I mean, we grow stuff, but I clearly my fondness of geometry, I think, derives from the farm. But also the thing I liked about the farm were that edge between the field and the ditch. There's always a kind of a wild zone, but it was not precisely manicured. There's kind of a rough zone, and that I think is quite beautiful.
What's the grid of the farm?
Well, you know, the fields and the rows. I mean, everything is organized along the classic linear geometry.
And do you think that being out there in the pastures has given you this kind of love for the natural things that grow also as part of the kind of more constrained, refined, artsy part of your work?
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, you love Iowa.
Well, I still have family there. I go back often.
Yeah. So here's a more profound, very profound question. It's great to see the recent work and the process. In your decades of experience, what do you think has been the biggest change to the agency of landscape architecture, particularly in New York City? And what is your sense of the future of the discipline?
Well, I think New York City actually is unique in that landscape architects have always had agency in the city because of Frederick Law Olmsted and his work. And always the New York City Parks Department has been the largest employer of landscape architects in the city. They are the largest firm, if you will, in the city. And so I think, and also in the civic organizations, like the Municipal Art Society always recognized landscape as part of the professions that were dealing with civic urbanism. I'm a member of the Architecture League of New York, which has a seat on the board for landscape architecture. So I think landscape architects have always had a particular agency in New York City, but I think in the last couple of decades, their agency elsewhere across the country has been increasing. I think because of the nature of the problems that we have to draw upon. It's no longer a building and space left over. I mean, it's really an urbanism that it has to knit all this stuff together. And so I think landscape architects are a key part of that kind of broader sense of how you create things within the urban structure and urbanism and life and things.
Do you think that we invert that idea? Do you think that the rest of the disciplines, allied disciplines, are feeling that as well? In other words, I think there have been many, many decades, centuries of architecture kind of dominating the spatial design industry, and I personally foresee a shift.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Well, I think just in my career, I've seen the sort of a breaking down of professional boundaries. And so it's a much more fluid now about who can do what. I mean, so I think that's probably healthy because it creates more opportunity.
And more collaboration.
More collaboration, yeah.
Great. How do you consider plan selection during design in terms of long-term maintenance? I have worked in GSA projects where maintenance is quite a challenge and often limits design.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
Well, I always start with soil because especially in urban areas, you always have to fight to find enough soil to do anything because so much of what we're doing is on structure. And so, you know, the soil, just as the foundation of the building is the foundation, soil is the foundation of landscape. And if you don't really have good soil, you're not going to have good landscape. But what I've been learning about plants recently, we work with Jim Urban a lot on tree selection and actually picking the right trees for the environment. I've been learning a lot about urban shade and the problems of growing things in urban shade. And then from Noel Kingsbury, who works with Pete Olaf. Yeah, he does really. So he's really done so much research on how plants propagate and whether they propagate fast and move around, or whether they are clonal and they stay in place and have more longevity. And so I think when picking plants, it's not a matter of just picking the flower and the leaf and that stuff, but you kind of need to understand how plants grow and how they survive over time and how they grow and change. Because if you want the landscape to continue to look good over a period of time, you need to do that. Although I also remember that Pete Olaf said when we were doing 200 West Street, he said, you know, you have to create the landscape that's going to perform well under the site conditions of when you initially build it, because there the gardens were under trees, but the trees were tiny. And so we had to have plants that could take sun. And then over time, he said, you're going to need to shift the plant palette as the trees grow in and start to change the environment. So I think the whole notion that you plant something and it's going to stay like that static forever is probably not the right way of thinking about it. You need to actually think about how the garden or the planting of the landscape is going to evolve over time and change, because change is part of nature.
It's funny, anecdotally, my parents, the architect and this architect combo, and there was this battle between them sometimes, you know, the architect requiring mom, the landscape architect, to grow these instant forests to make the building look good. And no, it takes time, it takes time. But anyway, the desperation between them was incredible. So let's shift a little bit to a different scale. And I know that materials are very important in your work. And how important is local resourcing? The audience would like to know local materials.
Yeah, I mean,
and the life cycle of materials.
Yes, that's a great question. Right now we're working on a project where I want to use Manhattan schist, which is the bedrock of Manhattan, and I have no idea where we get Manhattan schist. So we're going to have to do a great deal of research and talking to stone people to see how we can get authentic Manhattan schist and how it's quarried, where it comes from, and all of that. But we do spend a lot of time doing material research and understanding materials and how they fit together. And sometimes projects have a short lifespan, and you have a lot more flexibility in terms of durability. But other times you know, like on the Croton Reservoir water filtration plant, which is something that's being designed for, you know, at least 100-year lifespan. I mean, we're really looking at very durable materials that are going to survive. And even on that project, the stone was all sourced from you know, New York State, and materials are very local. And part of it is it's an environmental thing, but it's also just a resonance with the local environment. You know, oftentimes the local materials just perform better, fit better, and are more appropriate.
Do you think, I'm going to interject here, do you think that there's a little bit of a shift there from, 20 years ago using plastic or materials extracted and then shipped from China, for instance, for a project in New York, to really trying to localize the material, the source, the carbon.
No, the carbon issue is a big driver now.
Okay, I'm gonna check one thing. Give me a second. I don't know that there are questions in the chat, but I have some other questions I'd like to ask you.
Okay.
So there was a question that I really wanted to ask you. Oh yeah. So in terms of design process and what drives the concept, this is, sometimes it's an encounter with the site and you have this aha moment or an arbitrary idea that you might draw a priori, a rigorous study, site analysis of the site, or a distant source of inspiration, like an artist.
Yeah.
How
Well,
does it go?
it's all of those.
In any particular order, or
It depends on the project. We're working on a public space, and I had done some early designs for it. And at an early meeting, the client said his father had a collection of antiquities, and in particular, they had 3 woolly mammoth skeletons.
Oh, the ones I saw back in
And could we incorporate them into the design? And I remember thinking, "Whoa, that came out of the blue." And I thought, but that's kind of interesting. And so we developed a scheme incorporating the woolly mammoth skeletons, which is really quite remarkable. And I mean, I wouldn't have come up with that on my own, but the particulars of that project, that was what came out, and it's kind of amazing.
Who would have thought? That's great. And I was going to also ask, is there a project you're waiting for?
Oh, goodness. Well, there are some types that we've never really got to work on very much. We've never really done very much campus work. And I think it's sort of the scale of a campus would be interesting. I mean, so much of our work is really urban, where we're dealing with the specific site, which is very kind of, framed property, and having something that is a little bit larger scale, like a campus, or even something more rural or suburban. We have very little of that kind of work in our office, and that would be kind of interesting. Maybe working on the transformation of a dead mall would be kind of cool.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Into an urban farm or a suburban
Something.
farm. Yeah.
Harvesting that parking lot and making something out of that.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't have any more questions from the chat, but I thought I had one more up my sleeve. Oh yes. So after your many successful years of practice and many more to come, what advice would you give the next generation of designers, architects, landscape architects, spatial thinkers, urbanists? What's coming?
Well, change. It's always that goes without, things are going to be different. And so I think you have to be open to change, because if you're going to try to fight change, you're probably going to lose. And so being open and actually dealing with sort of the evolving programs and clients and circumstances sort of honestly, and trying to really deal with the real circumstances and solve the real problems, I think is a good thing, because you're more likely to be successful that way. And you have to train yourself. You have to learn new skills, and even in practice, you have to learn new skills as you're over time, because there's always new challenges.
So let me ask you a very deep question that hinges on this. What about the current period in which we're living in terms of environmental issues, climate change, environmental social justice, for that matter, and the work of your firm and designers in general? There's in some cases a gloom and doom perspective, and in others, no, everything that we do is vital. Somewhere in the middle. Where do you tell us?
I don't know.
We need to
It
learn
does-
from you, Ken.
I know. It does seem that the progressive changes are glacial,
Mhm.
which is sad.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, when I go back home to Iowa and drive across the farmland where my grandfather was from, there are windmills everywhere,
Mhm.
and you do see changes happening, and you see even in New York City in the last 20 years the whole recovery of the ecology of the waterfronts and the use of green roofs. I mean, progressive change does happen, but it's not easy, and it's not as fast as we all would like it to be, or as fast as it needs to be, really, to deal with the circumstances. But
Yeah, and I think I would tap on to that, what some of what you were saying earlier, this kind of social and spatial components to the projects, or environmental and social, sorry. You know, we are tackling it at both ends. We need to do more, but also it just means that we're really in the spotlight, which is a great moment to be charged, I think.
Yeah.
So I hope you feel very empowered.
well, I do think the academy is stepped up, and I think that the people coming out of the schools have a much better training in many ways than I did when I came out of school. I mean, I had learned the basics, but I don't think I think the kind of social and environmental agenda that the young people are bringing out of school is much more advanced than it certainly was when I was in school. So that's very hopeful.
And then they need to, you know, they're going to have to learn the skill. Maybe the view is ampler. But, anyway, thank you very, very much, both of you. I think this has been a really thoughtful and insightful presentation and conversation. I'm very honored to have had this opportunity with both of you and the guys out there in the studio, in the workshop. And I'm going to hand it back over to Anne.
And I'd like to put in my thanks to all of you. That was an amazing presentation that I think took us close to the site, but not quite there. Hopefully, maybe sometime this summer, Ken, we can arrange a walkthrough with all of you through some of these projects, at least for our New York League members. And please stay tuned. As I mentioned, later this summer, we'll announce next fall's set of programs. Thanks everyone for coming. And we look forward to seeing you in the new season.